One confidential evening, not 3 months ago, Lionel Wallace told me the story of the door in the wall. And I thought at the time that, so far as he was concerned, it was a true story. He told it with such a direct simplicity of conviction. But in the morning, in my own flat, I woke to a rather different atmosphere. And as I lay in bed and recalled the things that he told me, stripped of the glamour of his earnest, slow voice and the shadowy atmosphere that wrapped about him, I saw it all as frankly incredible. He was mystifying, I said to myself, but how well he did it. And it isn't quite the thing I just expected him, of all people, to do well. Afterwards, as I sat up in bed and sipped my morning tea, I found myself trying to account for the flavour of reality that had perplexed me in his impossible reminiscences by supposing that they did in some way suggest or present or convey, I hardly know which word to use, but experiences that it was otherwise impossible to tell. Well, I don't resort to that explanation now. I've got over my intervening doubts. I believe now, as I believed at the time of telling, that Wallace did, to the very best of his ability, strip the truth of his secret for me. But whether he really saw, or only thought he saw, whether he was the possessor of an inestimable privilege or the victim of a fantastic dream, that I cannot pretend to guess. That much you must judge for yourselves. Now, I forget now what chance comment of mine moved so reticent a man to confide in me in the first place. He was, I think, defending himself against an imputation of slackness that I made in relation to a great public movement in which he disappointed me. But he plunged suddenly. I have a preoccupation, he said. I know I've been negligent and I'm sorry, but, well, the fact is, old man, and it's not a case of ghosts or apparitions. I mean, it's an odd thing to tell of, but I'm haunted. I'm haunted by something that rather takes the light out of things, that fills me with longings. He paused, checked by that shyness that so often overcomes Englishmen when we would speak of moving or grave or beautiful things. And then, haltingly at first, but afterwards much more easily, he began to tell me of the thing that was hidden in his life, the haunting memory that made all the interest and spectacle of worldly existence seem dull and tedious and vain. And you see, now that I have the clue of it, of course, the thing seems written visibly in his face. I've got a photograph of him in which just that look of detachment has been caught and intensified. It reminds me of what a woman once said of him, a woman who'd loved him very much. Suddenly, she said, the interest goes out of him. He forgets you. He doesn't care a rap for you, under his very nose. And yet, you see, the interest was not always out of Lionel Wallace. And when he was holding his attention to a thing, he could contrive to be an extremely successful man. The door in the wall came into his life early, when he was a little boy between 5 and 6 years old. I recall now, as he sat making his confession to me, he reasoned and reckoned the date of it. There was a crimson Virginia creeper in it, he said, and there were horse chestnut leaves on the pavement in front of the door. I remember that clearly, and that they were blotched, yellow and green. They weren't brown or dirty, so they must have been newly fallen, and I take it that means October. So yes, I'd have been about 5 years and 4 months old. He was, he said, a rather precocious little fellow. His mother had died when he was born, and his earliest years were spent under the care of a nursery governess. His father was a stern, preoccupied man, a prominent lawyer who gave him little attention and expected great things of him. But for all his brightness, young Lionel found life grey and dull, and one day he wandered. Now, he couldn't recall the particular neglect that enabled him to get away that day, nor the precise course that he took among the West Kensington streets. All that had faded among the incurable blurs of memory. But the white wall and the green door stood out quite distinctly. At the very first sight of that door, he said, he experienced an intense emotion, a strong desire to go up to it, open it, and walk in. He insisted that he somehow knew from the very beginning that the door was unfastened. But at the same time, he had the clearest conviction that it was either unwise or wrong of him to yield to this attraction. And it was very clear in his mind, too, that if he went through that door, then his father would be very angry. I can picture it to myself clearly, that curious little boy, drawn and repelled at the same time. And Wallace himself described it to me with the utmost particularity. He went right past the door, he said, and then, with his hands in his pockets and making an infantile attempt to whistle, he strolled right along beyond the end of the wall. And there he recalls a number of dirty little shops, particularly that of a plumber and a decorator with a dusty pile of earthenware pipes and tins of enamel paint. He was pretending to examine these when suddenly, with a gust of emotion, he made a run for it, went plump with outstretched hand through the green door, that it slammed behind him, and in a trice he came into the garden that haunted his life. Now, it was very difficult for Wallace to give me his full sense of the place. But there was something in the very air of it that exhilarated, he said, that gave one a sense of lightness and good happening and well-being. In the very moment that that door swung behind me, I forgot the road with its fallen chestnut leaves and cabs and tradesmen's carts. I forgot all hesitations and fear and discretion, all the intimate realities of life. And I became in a moment a very glad and wonder-happy little boy. He mused before he went on. There were two great panthers there, he said. Yeah, spotted panthers. And I wasn't at all afraid, you see. There was a long, wide path with flower borders on either side, and these two huge, velvety beasts were playing on it with a ball. One of them came straight up to me, purring, rubbed its ear against my hand, and the size of the place, oh, good heavens, it stretched so far and wide. This way and that. I believe that there were hills in the distance. Heaven knows where West Kensington had got to. And there was a keen sense of homecoming in my mind too, you see. So when presently a tall, beautiful girl appeared in the pathway and lifted me and kissed me and put me down and led me by the hand, there was no amazement. There was only an impression of delightful rightness, of being reminded of happy things that had, in some strange way, been long overlooked. There were broad steps between spikes of delphinium, I remember, and we went up these to a great avenue lined with old dark trees. And along this avenue, this beautiful girl led me, asking me questions in a soft, sweet voice and telling me things, such pleasant things, although what they were, I was never able to recall. Presently, a little grinning monkey with ruddy brown fur and kindly hazel eyes came down a tree and ran beside me, chattering, and then it leapt on my shoulder. And so the three of us went on our way in the utmost happiness. I remember little things. We passed an old man musing among laurels and a place gay with parakeets. And then we came through a broad colonnade to a kind of a palace full of beautiful things and people. And in some way, I don't know how, but it conveyed to me that everyone was glad to see me. Playmates I found there, and that meant a lot because I was a lonely little boy. But it's odd, I can't remember the games that we played. Afterwards, as a child, I spent long hours trying to recall those games, but all I can remember is the happiness and the two dear playfellows in particular who were most with me. Eventually, a woman arrived with a grey, pale face and dreamy eyes, and she carried a book with her, and she beckoned me and took me aside into a gallery above a hall. Now, my playmates were loath to have me go, and they stood watching sadly as I was carried away. "Come back to us," they cried, "come back to us soon." I looked up at the lady's grave, gentle face, but she heeded them not at all. She took me to a seat in the gallery, and I stood beside her, ready to look at a book. As she opened it on her knee, the pages fell open, and I looked at it, marveling. For in the living pages of that book, I saw myself. It was a story about me, and in it were all the things that had happened since I was born. And the pages of that book, they weren't pictures. They were realities. They must have been realities. People moved, and things came and went in them. My dear mother, then my father, the servants, the nursery, all the familiar things of home, and then the front door, and the busy streets, and at last there was me, hovering and hesitating outside the green door in the long white wall. "And what's next?" I cried. I tried to turn the page, but the cool hand of the woman delayed me. "What's next?" I insisted, and struggled with the hand, pulling up her fingers with all my childish strength. And as she yielded, and the page came over, she bent down upon me like a shadow and kissed my brow. But you see, the page didn't show the enchanted garden, it didn't show the panthers, or the girl who'd led me by the hand, or the playfellows who'd been so loath to let me go. It showed a long grey street in West Kensington in that chill hour of afternoon just before the lamps are lit, and a little boy weeping unrestrainedly. And you see, this was no longer a page in a book. This was reality. That enchanted palace, the grave mother at whose knee I'd stood, gone. He fell silent and stared into the fire. "Well," I said after a moment. "Well, there I was. Yeah. Poor little Lionel, brought back to this grey world again. And as I realised the fullness of what had happened, I gave way to quite ungovernable grief. God, the shame of that public weeping, it clings to me still, it does. And my humiliating homecoming, I can still see the benevolent old gentleman in gold spectacles who stopped and spoke to me, and the rather nervous young policeman who marched me sobbing and frightened to the steps of my father's house, and the terrible questioning that followed, of course. I tried to tell them about the garden, and my father thrashed me for telling lies. And then, when I tried to tell my aunt, she punished me again for my wicked persistence. And then everyone was forbidden to listen to me, to even hear a word about it. Even my fairy tale books were taken away from me because I was too imaginative. They actually said that. Can you believe it? And so my story was driven back upon myself. I whispered it into my pillow, and I added always to my official and less fervent prayers this one heartfelt request: "Please, God, may I dream of the garden. Take me back to the garden. Take me back, Heavenly Father." And I did dream of it often. I may have added to it, I may have changed it, of course, I don't know. All this, you must understand, this is an attempt to reconstruct from fragmentary memories a very early experience. Between that and the other consecutive memories of my boyhood, there's a great gulf. He paused again, and I asked an obvious question. "No," he said. "No, I don't remember that I ever did attempt to find my way back to the garden in those early years." Yeah, no, I agree, it does. It seems odd, but I think that, well, very probably I was kept a closer watch on after that first time. And it wasn't until school that I tried for the garden again. "Do you remember me at St Athelstan's?" "Of course I remember you," I said. How can you ask that?" "No, I know, but did you ever play Northwest Passage with me?" "I know, of course, you lived in the other direction." "Well, it was a good game, Northwest Passage. The idea was to discover a new way to school. You started off 10 minutes early in some almost hopeless direction, and you had to work your way round through unaccustomed streets to the school gate. Well, one day I got entangled among some rather low-class streets on the other side of Campden Hill, and I was beginning to think that for once the game would be against me. I was just going to be late for school. I rather desperately tried this street that looked like a cul-de-sac, and sure enough, I found at the end of it a passage. And as I hurried through with renewed hope, I passed a row of frowsy little shops that were oddly familiar to me, and then suddenly, there it was. My long white wall and my green door. Now, I suppose that this second encounter, you see, it marks the difference between the busy life of the schoolboy and the infinite leisure of the child. Anyway, this second time, I didn't for a moment think of going straight in. You know, my mind was full of the idea of getting to school on time for not breaking my record for punctuality. Oh, of course, I must have felt some desire to at least try the door. I must have done. And I was immediately interested by the discovery, of course. You know, I went on with my mind full of it, but I went on, you see. And it didn't check me. And I got to school, breathless with sweat and perspiration, but I was on time. I expect I was probably pretty inattentive in class that morning, recalling what I could of the beautiful, strange people that I should presently see again. I mean, I had no doubt that they'd be glad to see me. Yeah, I must have thought of the garden that morning just as a jolly sort of place to which one might resort in the interludes of a strenuous scholastic career. Well, I didn't go that day at all. The next day was a half holiday, and that may have weighed in me. I don't know. What I do know is that the enchanted garden was so much on my mind that I couldn't keep it to myself. I told, oh God, what was his name now? His ferrety looking lad. We used to call him Squiffer. Hopkins, I said. Yes, that was it, Hopkins. Squiffer Hopkins. I told Squiffer Hopkins. I mean, I didn't like telling him. I had a feeling that in some way it was against the rules to tell him. But you know, he was walking part of the way home with me, and if we hadn't talked about the enchanted garden, we'd have talked of something else. And well, I just couldn't think of anything else, you see. So I blabbed, and then Hopkins blabbed too, of course. And the next day at break time, I found myself surrounded by half a dozen bigger boys, half teasing and wholly curious to hear more about this enchanted garden. It was Fawcett. You remember him? Big Brute, and Carnaby, and Morley Reynolds. Yeah, I suspect actually on some level I was probably a little flattered to have the attention of these big fellows. In fact, I do remember a moment of pleasure when Crawshaw, you remember Crawshaw, son of Crawshaw the composer? Yeah, well, he said that it was the best lie that he'd ever heard. But at the same time, far more strongly, there was this undertow of real shame at telling what I felt was, in fact, a sacred secret. Fawcett made a nasty joke about the beautiful girl, and I pretended not to hear it. And then Carnaby suddenly got aggressive, called me a dirty liar, and he got even angrier when I insisted that it was true. I said I could lead them all to the green door in 10 minutes if they didn't believe me, and Carnaby said that I damn well have to. Yeah, well, did you ever have Carnaby twist your arm? No, well, lucky you. I mean, there's nobody in the school then to save a chap from Carnaby, although Crawshaw did put in a good word. Anyway, the outcome was that instead of starting alone for my enchanted garden, I set off, cheeks flushed, eyes smarting, and my soul burning with misery and shame, leading a party of 6 mocking schoolboys. And we never found it, of course. What you mean? I mean, I couldn't find it. Wall, door, garden, none of it. And afterwards, when I was alone, I couldn't find it either. I never found it. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me now that I was always looking for it all through my school days, but it never came up again. Well, did the fellows make it disagreeable? Oh, well, you can imagine, can't you? Absolutely beastly. I remember how I sneaked home and upstairs to hide the marks of my blubbering. But you see, when I cried myself to sleep at last, it wasn't for what Carnaby had done. It was for the garden. It was for the beautiful afternoon that I'd hoped to spend. It was for the sweet, friendly women and the waiting playfellows and the game that I'd hoped to learn again. That beautiful, forgotten game. I had bad times after that, I remember. Crying at night and wool gathering by day. For 2 terms, I slackened and had bad reports. Do you remember? Oh, of course you remember. It was your beating me in maths that brought me back to the grind again. I never saw the door again until I was 17. I was driving to Paddington on my way to Oxford for the scholarship exam, and I just caught a momentary glimpse. I was leaning over the apron of my cab, smoking a cigarette, no doubt thinking myself no end of a man of the world, and suddenly there was the door, the wall, The dear sense of unforgettable and attainable wonders. I was too taken by surprise to stop the cab until we were well past and round a corner. And then I had the queerest moment. It was a double and divergent movement of my will. I tapped the little door on the roof of the cab, and I immediately brought my arm down to pull out my watch. "Yes, sir," said the cabman. "Oh, no, nothing, nothing. Sorry, my mistake. Sorry, we haven't much time, but please go on." And he did. And I got my scholarship, and the night after I found out, I sat over my fire in my room, my father's rare praise and sound counsels ringing in my ear, and I smoked my favourite pipe. And I thought of that door in the long white wall. I mean, if I had stopped, I told myself, I would have missed my scholarship. I'd have missed Oxford, muddled all the fine career before me. I fell musing deeply, but I did not doubt then, you see, that this career of mine was a thing that merited sacrifice, you know? I mean, those dear playmates, that clear atmosphere, seemed very sweet to me, very fine, but remote. My grip was fixing now upon the world. I saw another door opening, the door of my career. He stared again into the fire. Its red lights picked out a stubborn strength in his face for just one flickering moment, and then it vanished again. Well, I've served that career. Oh, I've done much work, much hard work. But you see, I've dreamt of that enchanted garden 1,000 times since then. And I've seen the door 4 times. Yeah, 4 times. I mean, for a while, the world was so bright and interesting and full of meaning and opportunity that the half-effaced charm of the garden seemed absurd and remote. I mean, who wants to play ball with panthers when one can dance with beautiful women? I came down from Oxford a man of bold promise that I have, I think, done something to redeem. I mean, there have been disappointments, of course there have. Twice I've been in love, I'm not going to dwell on that. But once, as I went to someone who I knew doubted whether I dared to come, I took a shortcut through an unfrequented road near Earl's Court, and I happened upon a white wall and a familiar green door. "That's odd," I said to myself. "I thought this place was on Campden Hill. It's the place I could never find somehow, the place of that queer daydream of mine." I had just a moment's impulse to try the door. 3 steps aside were all that was needed, and I was sure in my heart that it would open to me. And then, you see, I thought that doing so might delay me on the way to that appointment which I thought my honour was involved. Afterwards, I was very sorry for my punctuality. Yeah, I might at least have peeped in, I thought, waved a hand at the panthers. But no, I knew enough by this time not to seek again belatedly that which is not found by seeking. Yeah, that time made me very sad. Well, years of hard work after that, and never a sight of the door. It's only recently that it's come back to me. And you see, with it, there has come a sense as though some thin tarnish has spread itself over my world. All right, perhaps it's overwork. Perhaps it's what I've heard spoken of as the feeling of 40. I don't know. But I do know that the keen brightness that makes effort easy has gone out of things recently. And that just at a time with all these new political developments when I ought to be working harder than ever, I began a little while ago to want the garden quite madly. And I've seen it 3 times since. "What, the garden?" I said. "Oh, no, sorry, no, just the door. 3 times I've had my chance. 3 times. If ever that door offers itself to me again, I swore I will go in, out of this dust and heat, out of this dry glitter and vanity, out of these toilsome futilities. I'll go in and I'll never return. This time I will stay. I swore it. And when the time came, I didn't go. 3 times in 1 year I have passed that door and failed to enter. 3 times. The first was on the night of the snatch division on the tenants' redemption bill, on which the government was saved by a majority of 3. Yeah, of course you remember. Now, on our side, perhaps very few on the opposition, nobody expected the end that night. And then you see the debate collapse like eggshells. Hotchkiss and I, we were dining with his cousin at Brentford, and we were suddenly called up by telephone and set off at once in his cousin's motor. I mean, we barely got to the house in time. And on the way there, we passed my wall and my door, livid in the moonlight, blotched with hot yellow as the glare of our lamps lit it, but it was absolutely unmistakable. My God, I cried. What? Said Hotchkiss. Oh, nothing, I answered, and the moment passed. I've made a great sacrifice, I told the whip as I got in. They all have, he said, and hurried by. I don't see how I could actually have done otherwise then. The next occasion was as I rushed to my father's bedside to bid that stern old man farewell, and then to, of course, the claims of life are imperative. But the third time was different. It was only a week ago, and it fills me with hot remorse to recall it. I was with Gurkha and Ralph's. I mean, it's no secret, you know, that I've had my talks with Gurkha. We'd been dining at Frobisher's, and the talk had become pretty intimate between us. The question of my place in the reconstructed ministry lay always just over the boundary of the discussion. Well, that's all settled now. Yeah, well, okay, it's probably best not to talk about it yet, but there's no reason to keep it a secret from you. Yes, thank you very much, but please just let me get on with my story. On that particular night, you see, things were still very much in the air. My position was a very delicate one. I was anxious to get some definite word from Gurkha, but I was hampered by Ralph's presence. Now, I was doing my damnedest to keep that light and careless talk not too obviously directed at the point that concerned me. Well, I had to. You know, Ralph's behaviour since has more than justified my caution. Now, Ralph's, I knew, would leave us just beyond Kensington High Street, and then I planned to surprise Gurkha with a sudden frankness. I mean, sometimes one has to resort to these little devices. And then it was that in the margin of my field of vision, I became aware once more of the white wall and the green door, just a little way before us down the road. We passed it as we were talking. You know, I can still see the shadow of Gurkha's profile, his opera hat tilted forward over his nose, going before my shadow and Ralph's as we sauntered past. You know, I passed within 20 inches of the door. If I say good night to them now and I go in, I said to myself, what will happen? Yeah, they'll think I'm mad. And suppose I was to vanish suddenly now anyway. You know, 1,000 inconceivably petty worldlinesses weighed in on me in that moment of crisis. And so here I am. Here I am. 3 times in 1 year it has appeared, and that door that goes into peace, into delight, into a beauty beyond dreaming, a kindness that no man on earth can know. And 3 times I've rejected it. It's gone. Well, how do you know it's gone? I asked. Oh, God, I know. I know. I'm left now to work it out alone, to stick to the tasks that held me so strongly when my moments came. What? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I have had success. I have had that vulgar, tawdry, irksome, much envied thing. I've had it in abundance. But let me tell you something, my friend. This loss is destroying me. For 2 months, nearly 10 weeks now, I've done nothing. No work at all, except the most necessary and urgent duties. At nights, when it's less likely that I should be recognised, I go out. I wander the streets. No, I do. You know, I wonder what people would think if they knew a cabinet minister, the head of that most vital of all departments, wandering alone, grieving, you know, sometimes audibly lamenting for a door that he can never find, a garden that he'll never visit again. I can see now his rather pallid face and the unfamiliar somber fire that had come into his eyes. Yeah, no, I do. I see him very vividly tonight. They found his body very early yesterday morning. in a deep excavation near East Kensington Station, one of two shafts that had been dug for the extension of the Underground Railway. It's protected from the intrusion of the public by a hoarding in which a small doorway has been cut for the convenience of workmen who live in that direction. Now, the doorway was left unfastened through a misunderstanding between two gangers, and through it Lionel made his way. It seemed that he walked all the way from Westminster that night. He'd frequently walked home during the past session, apparently. I can picture his dark form coming along the late and empty streets, wrapped up, intent. I mean, it did perhaps the pale electric lights near the station cheat the rough planking into a semblance of white? Did that fatal unfastened door awaken in him some memory? Was there, after all, ever any green door in the wall at all? I don't know. There are times when I believe that Wallace was no more than the victim of the coincidence between a rare but not unprecedented type of hallucination and a careless trap. But that is not my profoundest belief. I mean, you may think me superstitious, if you will, and foolish, but I'm more than half convinced that he had, in truth, an abnormal gift, and a sense, something, I don't know what, that in the guise of wall and door offered him an outlet, a secret and peculiar passage of escape into another, an altogether more beautiful world. Well, it betrayed him in the end, you say, but did it? Did it betray him? I mean, there you see, I think you touch upon the inmost mystery of these dreamers, these men of vision and imagination. We see our world fair in common, the hoarding and the pit. I mean, by our daylight standard, he walked out of security into darkness, danger, and death. But did he see it like that?